I am super honored to get to come and speak to you, although like everybody else says, I can't actually see you guys. What a privilege. And I'm going to talk about forms, which I know is everybody's least favorite topic. So thank you for trying to sit through this. Hopefully we'll make them a little bit more interesting. So I want to hit three things today. First, why are forms so hard? I have some ideas about that. Second, are there any solutions to why they're so hard? And third, we'll do a little bit of a demo time. Quick show of hands, how many of you spend a significant portion of your time doing form development? Yeah, okay, it's amazing. It's literally everybody. And this is incredible, isn't it? Like, why is it that we do that? I mean, for one thing, it's where the internet actually happens. It's where transactions happen. But I also think it's partially because it's harder than it was, or harder than it should be. And we're going to talk about that. Real quick, this is me, Justin Schröder, although up there it's got an umlaut, so you can say it however you prefer. And these are some of the open source libraries that I'm a part of: FormKit, Arrow.js, AutoAnimate, Tempo, which just came out like last week or something, and it's a date library. Go check it out. Drag and Drop, which I think came out, I don't know, like 5 days ago, even less. And then for you Vue 2 users, you may recognize Vue Formulate, which was also a library I wrote. But first, let's dispel a myth that forms are easy. Forms aren't easy, but you will hear this all the time. Okay, just use some form data and native validation, right? And I mean, you guys have already seen form data multiple times on stage today. And you know, yes, you actually should do this. If your form is small, like most of the forms have been out there today, you should do this, right? I'm not saying that you shouldn't. How about this one? The frameworks have basically solved forms, whether you're in React or you're in Vue with something like vModel. There's a lot of solutions to forms out there. The frameworks have solved them. So Ryan Florence of Remix fame had this interesting quote: "I don't think there should even be form abstractions. Forms are fundamentally markup, user interactions, event handling, state management, requests. Between React and Remix, what will a form library add here? Toss in some validation functions and be done with it." And this is a prevalent idea. And I think it's basically this, right? This is what they're describing. And unfortunately, and I count myself among library authors, we sort of, as library authors, see the problems that are out there as a very simplistic thing because we're trying to reproduce them and solve them at a simplistic level. But the reality is that this is what most of you are actually dealing with, right? An airplane is fundamentally represented by wings and a propeller. But what we actually deal with on a daily basis is very complicated and very messy. How many of your forms are messy? All of them. If they're not, you're lying. We're not talking about login forms, okay? We're talking about everything else. So here's some of the reasons that forms are actually painful. First of all, there's just a ton of boilerplate code, right? You've got a bunch of like fancy non-native inputs. Like, yeah, it's easy to have a text input or a select input, but how about that autocomplete that you need or something like that? Accessibility. I guarantee you your forms aren't accessible. State management. You got internationalization. Like, how many of you have written translations for all your error messages, right? These are things that you have to do that you don't want to do, and if you don't, you're skipping some steps. So what are some solutions to the problem? Well, we need a store. We need to model the data in some kind of a store. And this is what I did. It's amazing that this library came out 7 years ago, and not a single one of you has ever used it because nobody even knew it existed. I think it has like 1 download a week on NPM. And the solution to this problem, in my mind, was, we need to model the data in the store. We'll take all of those complicated things, like the state management and some of the conditionality and some of the validation pieces, and we'll put that in the store. And then that will generally solve this problem. And it turned out that this actually did work really well, except for all of that stuff. The only part of Vue Formulate 1 that we liked was the components. We wrote components, and the components did a great job of solving the boilerplate and sort of the non-native inputs, the complicated interactions. It solved accessibility because we could bake those into the components right from the beginning. But so we decided, okay, well, let's keep the components and throw away the rest. So that's what we did. Components must be the solution to forms. Let's just use more components and try to model it that way. And so that's what we did in Vue Formulate 2. Did anybody in this room use that library? Okay, there's 6 of you. Thank you. So those 6 people would know that in Vue Formulate, we solved all of the problems in the components. The components themselves had their own state management, their structured data, their validation, blah, 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 blah. It was all in there. And this worked great except for this stuff. It turns out that the components really didn't solve any of the fundamental problems we had except for the same things that were previously being solved. And components are frankly everywhere now, right? I mean, you can throw a stone and hit 13 UI libraries on the way. There are tons and tons of UI libraries, and almost all of them include some amount of form elements. And that's not a bad thing. I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. I'm just saying they don't really solve the form problem. Forms are still painful. We're solving a very small subset of the issues. So if components are solving, just a little bit of this, what is the rest? And I want to say, I think it's architecture. There's something unique about forms that's different about them than the rest of our application. And I don't think it's well modeled. So in 2021, we're sitting around, Vue Formulate's, out there, and some people are using it. We're using it. We're working at an agency. And we're just thinking, like, why are these things so hard? Like, why are they fundamentally so challenging? And then we had this epiphany moment. It was like we got a whisper from on high about what might be actually the problem. And that's what I want to tell you about. So to demonstrate that, let's look at this little API request. We've got some API requests we're going to send off to the Federal Reserve. We've got a name, email, a small little nested object, some notifications with an array inside of it. It's not very complicated data, but you could imagine your application doing something like this. And then we have a form that represents that. Here's a very simple form. And we know that the amount of work it takes to make that form is deceptively a lot. For example, here's the markup for that form. And the tailwind definitely makes it look a little worse than it is. But this is an insane amount of boilerplate code. And you might be thinking, oh, well, I don't need that many wrapper elements and stuff. And you're probably doing something wrong if you don't have them, to be honest. Most of the time, if you just have 1 or 2 things, you probably don't have accessible help text. You probably don't have a bunch of other things going on, which is why you should probably use a library. Okay, so components do solve this a little bit, right? This is easier. This is simpler. Now we've got some components to represent some of those elements. It's not that complicated. But the important thing here is not the components. It's that this form on the left-hand side is actually producing the right objects on the output. It automatically structures it. So we could diagram this out real quick, okay? Here is basically a component diagram of what's happening. We have a form at the top. We've got a couple of components in there, some personal details, notification settings, some layout, maybe we got some, cool layout things going on in a component. And then somewhere down inside of there, we actually have the inputs that are collecting data for us. Now, again, as a reminder, this is producing the right structured data. And you can kind of walk through here and you can sort of see it, right? Your form is like producing this outer object. And these inputs down here, here's the name input and here's the email input that we needed. The address is somehow working to create an object which has the street and the city inside of it. Your notification settings are also some kind of an object with another key inside of them, maybe an array inside of there with the emails. You can kind of see how this structures itself out a little bit. But we could diagram this another way, okay? We could diagram this as a tree. And in computer science, we would call this a general tree because each node could have many children. Now don't run away, okay? Trees are not that bad. In fact, you're probably used to them, right? We've been using trees to describe stuff forever, literally forever, for hundreds of years. This is a family tree from 1450. How about the tree of life, Charles Darwin, 1837? Trees are just a fundamental thing that we use to describe the world around us. And it turns out that in computer science, they've worked really well too. Right? Binary trees came around in 1940. Binary search trees, they allow us to sort data very quickly and search data very quickly. Abstract syntax trees have been with us forever, since the 1960s. They're sort of more important than ever now that we're doing so much parsing on our Vue code. But these trees have been around forever, but they're actually even more fundamental than those couple use cases. If you think about the web that you're used to, well, the HTML itself is a tree. And the CSS that you write is actually a tree format as well. And the accessibility in there is actually a tree. And the database indexes that you reference are actually trees. And the virtual DOM is a tree, and routers are trees, and everything's a tree, tree all the things. But interestingly enough, when we look at this diagram of our component tree, some of these components aren't there. They're not in the form tree that we drew earlier. And this is the fundamental problem with forms. This is why forms are so hard. Here's the DOM tree for that exact form, all those little divs. Here's the component tree, much simpler, but it's obviously quite distinct. But here's the form tree. And you can diagram the form tree as its own tree within there because it is a distinct tree. Forms are their own distinct trees. We just have never treated them that way. For the history of web development, we have not really treated them that way. And so what we've been trying to do for so long is essentially fit something into the wrong hole. We're trying to figure out ways to patch this together, and we just take shortcuts. At the end of the day, we take shortcuts. And again, I'm not talking about your login form. You know the form. You're thinking about the form in your mind right now. You know what I'm talking about. Forms have actually always been distinct trees, though. We just haven't noticed it. A form data, if you think about it, is actually a tree. It's a flat tree that's living inside of the DOM. For example, this exact same form, right? The inputs that are inside of there, if I just highlight those, they're kind of spread out all over the place, right? But form data automatically pulls them out of that tree and structures them. It's been doing that forever. The problem is that form data hasn't changed since roughly 1995. And there's a ton of limitations. You can't structure data, the keys aren't unique, you can't rehydrate, like I can't take data from the top of my tree and push it down the tree. I can't do any of these things. Validation, UX is frankly terrible. There's just a lot of problems with using form data on anything much more complicated than a simple registration form or a login form. So that's why I created FormKit. FormKit is a form framework. We're using a big word there. Framework's a big word. It's not a library. It is a library, but it's more than a library. It's intended to fundamentally solve forms. So how does it work? Well, when you use a FormKit component, you say something like FormKit type text. This is supposed to be roughly API compatible with just like an input. This automatically under the hood does something called create node. And it creates a little node in the graph. We could represent it with a dot. Okay, and if I do it again, I create a text area, it does it again. So now we have two nodes. Now if I put these inside of a form, this automatically self-assembles, right? So those two inputs automatically are part of that form. And this is roughly what currently happens with form data. But we can go farther. For one, it doesn't need to be in the same component tree at all. So these things could be, I mean, in the same tree, yes, but you could have many, many layers of components in between the form and where your actual input is. They'll automatically self-assemble through there. Also, you could use something like a group. And a group would then create another nested structure to allow you to further organize your data. We could take a couple more inputs, put them underneath there. We could create something called a list, which is basically an array of data, and put some inputs under there. And now we've structured data for our form automatically. And this looks abstract, but it's actually a perfect definition of something like a blog post. You've got a title, you've got some metadata, some information about that metadata, some tags that go along with it. Now, the connection between these node elements is really the magic. It allows you to do transport that you can't do in form data. For example, we can transport things like the values, but also state information, debound state, touch state, dirty state. We can know the validation state of just a subgroup of fields. All of this stuff we can do because it's a primitive now in our form building. Well, what else does FormKit do? So again, roughly, one FormKit component is roughly equal to one input. And if you say type checkbox, you get a type checkbox. If you say type select, you get a select. So again, The form API is weird. Why do we use input for a whole bunch of them and then other things for a whole bunch of other ones? If you want to have options, you can pass options. They're sort of like turbocharged inputs. And we do this for every single native input that exists. So anything that you can do with HTML, you can do automatically with FormKit. We also then have some pro inputs that are like a paid edition, and these are all of those ones that take you a month to write, you know, your autocompletes and color pickers and date pickers and things like that, because we are an open source project. It's kind of hard to make money as an open source project. And then also your validation is right there. You put the validation exactly where it's being used. You don't have to go have a model somewhere else. You don't need to prop drill 3 levels deep to get the validation to the right place, get the errors to the right place. It's automatically where it's supposed to be. Another feature that people really like is called FormKit Schema. And this allows you to generate your own forms. So here's a little word salad. FormKit Schema is a JSON serializable data format for storing DOM structures and component implementations, including FormKit forms. So including FormKit forms, you can actually render anything that Vue can render with the schema. So what is it and what's the big deal? Well, if you take a look here, I've got a boring div with a hello world. And I can represent this with a little bit of serializable JavaScript, JSON. This can just be pure JSON. And then I can take that and I can pump it right back into a component called FormKit Schema, and it renders my div. Doesn't seem that exciting. But the exciting part about this is now I can take my implementation, I can put it anywhere. I can store this in a database. I can put this in the cloud. I can generate it with ChatGPT. There's a lot of things I can do if I now have a known data structure. You could have dynamic forms on a page that get built. You could build form builders, all kinds of interesting things. And it works pretty simply. A $EL just means I'm going to render an element. CMP means I'm going to render a component. And FormKit means I'm rendering a FormKit element. But what makes it really powerful that doesn't exist in any other schema as far as I know is we support expressions. So you can actually have full Boolean logic right in your JSON. You can have arithmetic in there. You can have functional calls, conditional rendering of components. You can have slot rendering. You can have everything inside of here. I would not build your entire app using this. That's not what I'm trying to say. But I'm saying that you can build really complex experiences and ship them in a new way. So I'm going to risk a little demo time here. OK, let me make this bigger. OK. So right over here, you can see a little bit of schema. Here is a FormKit type form, and then the children inside of there is just a number. So here you can see what we're talking about, and this is pretty boring. Just lets me do some numbers. But what's interesting is that the default slot of any component gets automatically destructured to the children. So I have access to my entire form value right here, value. And if you take a look at what renders here, you'll see that it's an object. That's because I'm rendering the object data of my form. And then I can just talk about the other inputs that are in here, for example, quantity. And now I'm rendering this value right here, but it's reactive, fully reactive. So I can also then add expressions to this. Let's say my quantity is multiplied by some price. Now I have actual arithmetic going on. And if you're thinking, uh-oh, eval, it's not eval, I promise. It's a tiny little compiler that writes little functions for this. OK, now here you can see I can actually pass data in. So here I have a reactive, or ref, and you're passing this into the data prop of your FormKit schema. And now I can reference in my schema anything that was available in my data. So for example, here I have dollars, which is just using the INTL number format. And I can actually just directly call this dollars. And now I have actual formatting in here in a JSON compatible format. I would tell you a lot more about schema if I had more time, but I don't have more time. So FormKit has a ton of features, like way too many features for us to sit down and actually talk about today. And you know, that was a brief look at schema, but I want to do a little bit of live coding because I think it's better to do that than just try to list off all the things that we can do. And hopefully this sparks your imagination. So I'm going to build a little Nuxt app here. All right, I'm already running it. Let's see. Hey, here we go. It's a little recipe app, okay? Very simple. We're just asking for the recipe name, for some cooking time, ingredients, and so on and so forth. And as you might imagine, this is going to automatically send the data. I've got it rigged up so you can kind of see the data. And all it is here is we have a FormKit type form right here, and I'm getting the default value out of the form. There's no V-modeling anywhere, you'll notice. There's zero V-modeling. And then down inside of here, I've got my recipe name. I'm using a mask, and you can see I'm using a really fancy feature of the FormKit mask, which is that I can have an enumerated list that you bind the values to. So you can't actually see this, but when I come in here, you can see the selections are on very specific parts of my input. And if I just hit the up-down key, I'm automatically cycling through the values in that enum. Or I could, of course, type them, 56 seconds. So that's a little mask input. You've got things like a couple more text to select in here. Not that exciting, but you get the picture. Okay, so the magic of FormKit comes, again, with that tree structure. So what I can do here is I can actually take this entire chunk of code and just remove it and copy and paste it into the recipe fields here. So this is the exact same code, just copy and paste it. Now take a look at the script block up here. Notice that we are not V-modeling, we're not prop drilling, we're not doing anything. And I could take this and I could nest this as many layers deep as I want. Okay, now back over here, all I need to do is actually use it. Okay, and now our form has not changed. And amazingly, all my data is still flowing to the proper place. There's no V-modeling or prop drilling in between here, which means I now have an actual reusable piece of form. I can take that and I can put it somewhere else and I can nest other layers around it, and I don't need to worry about prop drilling through there. Again, the tree, the form tree, is its own distinct thing. How about the ingredient fields? Well, I can do that too. So let's go ahead and take this chunk, and as you might imagine, they are sitting right over here, my ingredient fields, inside of this little component, tiny little composable component. And as you might imagine, nothing is changing over here. And that's kind of cool, and you can see, I think you can see how that could be useful. But where this gets really interesting is if we start to kind of expand and flex what that tree can do. So for example, I can take this and I can say, still caps lock? Okay. Form kit. I'm going to put a repeater around this group of fields because we just made the, over here, this is like the worst recipe thing ever. You can have one ingredient, but your boss is going to be mad about that. So I'm going to say the name of this is ingredients. And now I automatically have a repeater field around this. And I can just add as many as I want here. And you'll notice that my data is automatically flowing to the right place. That component was reusable, and it was reusable with that array structure immediately because the form tree self-assembled itself. In addition, it automatically knows the validation state of everything that's underneath it. When I clicked the submit button, it knew what was invalid at that moment. In fact, I could come back to my main form, and I could actually extract out the current validation state right here. So we are constantly, carefully computing the state of your validation tree, of your form tree. So yeah, it's kind of ugly, but you can see all of the information about my tree is being computed as we go. But it's not just for my whole form. I could go down to one of these group elements, and I could know, is that one valid? Is that one valid? And at any level of depth inside of that tree, we can have full information about what's happening underneath it. This is a big unlock. One other fun fact is I can run FormKit theme here. Says, I found a local theme for Regenesis, and I can say, yeah, I want to edit that. And this will actually pull it up in the FormKit theme editor. And here you can see we have essentially like a complete kitchen sink of everything that's available. You can make these changes on the fly. And if I wasn't using Brave, I could click this button and it would automatically download and install it directly. I could click that button and it'll give me an npx command to run, but Brave is blocking my local request. I didn't use this in an isolated Brave profile the last time. All right, well, it's going to update my Tailwind styles whenever this finishes. So I don't know if you saw, I changed the border radius on my form, and now you can see my local project's been updated. Everything's changed. So that is a really brief look at a live code of FormKit. But we're not finished there. We've been working on this for, I don't know, a year and a half, 2 years, something like that. There's a lot more to come. This year, we really want to try to get some more of these inputs out, things like currency inputs and unit inputs, date range inputs, like the really painful ones. But also, we want to start shipping a lot of these first-party integrations, because although we ship HTML in the form of components, it's not really a UI library. We don't really want to be a UI library. Bring your own UI library. What we want to solve is the complexity of the form. So we'd like to have Vuetify and PrimeView and NuxtUI and anybody else. If you have a UI library, and you probably do, come and talk to us, because we'd love to we'd love to get an integration. Also, we're working on a form builder app, which is going to be extremely exciting, and maybe there's some other things that I'm not going to mention right now. So thank you. That's me. You can follow me on the X and in the FormKit. Jump in the Discord channel. There's always a lot of people in there. If you're having problems with forms and you want some solutions, there's probably somebody in there. And a shout out to the Vue School folks. They did an amazing job on a course there. And if you want some AirPods, if you scan this, there's like a 1-minute survey you can take, and we are actually going to give people AirPod Pros. So, okay, that's me. Thank you.